The jungle was never silent on Guadalcanal, but on the night of October 24, 1942, the noise changed. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Puller stood at his command post along a low ridge south of Henderson Field, listening to something that made every veteran Marine within earshot go still. Beyond the thin perimeter his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines held, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving through the darkness. The sound was unmistakable, equipment clanking, officers calling orders, wire cutters snapping through steel cable, the deliberate, methodical noise of an army preparing to attack. Puller's men heard it too. 600 Marines stretched along 1,500 yards of ridgeline, watching the jungle to their front. Some gripped their rifles tighter, others whispered urgent questions to their sergeants. The enemy was close, very close. Close enough to hear individual voices, close enough to kill with aimed fire. Yet, Puller had given explicit, uncompromising orders: hold your fire, do not engage, let them come. In the darkness, young Marines struggled to understand why their commander was allowing enemy soldiers to approach within grenade range without firing a shot. Everything in their training screamed that this was wrong. You engaged the enemy at maximum effective range. You broke up attacks before they gained momentum. You never let thousands of hostile troops mass within 30 yards of your foxholes. But Louis Puller wasn't making a mistake. He was executing the most carefully prepared defensive action of the Guadalcanal campaign. What those 3,500 Japanese soldiers approaching through the jungle didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that they were walking into a killing ground so precisely calibrated, so lethally integrated, that the coming hours would produce one of the most one-sided slaughters in Pacific War history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why Puller ordered his Marines to hold their fire while thousands of enemy soldiers advanced to point-blank range, you have to understand who Louis Puller was and what he had learned in 2 decades of jungle warfare that most officers never experienced. Louis Burwell Puller was 44 years old that October night. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private in 1918, hoping to reach France before the Great War ended. He arrived too late for combat in Europe, but his career was just beginning. The Marine Corps of the 1920s and 30s fought in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Haiti, Nicaragua, China. These weren't conventional wars with front lines and army-sized formations. They were counterinsurgency campaigns against guerrilla forces who knew every trick of ambush, infiltration, and night attack. Puller learned his craft, hunting Caco rebels in Haitian jungles and Sandinista guerrillas in Nicaraguan mountains. He learned that firepower mattered more than numbers, that patience could be as lethal as aggression, that the side which controlled the terrain and prepared the battlefield usually won, regardless of which side attacked. Most critically, he learned that in jungle warfare, the key to victory was making the enemy come to you, then destroying them with coordinated fires at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. By 1942, Puller commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His men called him Chesty for his barrel chest and aggressive command style. They also called him the best battalion commander in the Corps. He had an instinct for ground that couldn't be taught in any school. He could look at terrain and immediately understand where to place machine guns for interlocking fire, where to position mortars for maximum coverage, where the enemy would have to concentrate to attack, and exactly how to kill them when they did. That instinct would prove critical on Guadalcanal. Henderson Field was the reason American Marines were fighting and dying on this malarial jungle island in the southern Solomon Islands. The airfield itself was just a dirt runway carved from kunai grass and coconut groves, but it represented something far more important than its physical dimensions suggested. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air over the southern Solomons. Control the air, and you controlled the sea lanes. Control the sea lanes, and you controlled the entire strategic balance in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese understood this calculation perfectly. In August 1942, Marines had landed on Guadalcanal and seized the nearly complete airfield before Japanese forces could finish it. Since that moment, the Japanese had committed themselves to retaking Henderson Field at any cost. They fed troops onto the island by night, using fast destroyer runs to evade American air attacks. They launched multiple offensives throughout September and early October. Every attack had the same objective: break through the Marine perimeter, retake the airfield, eliminate American air power, and restore Japanese control over the region. By late October, the Japanese had assembled their largest force yet. The Sendai Division, 17,000 veteran troops, had been infiltrating Guadalcanal for weeks. These weren't garrison soldiers or hastily trained conscripts. They were professional infantry from one of Japan's elite divisions, men who had fought in China and the Dutch East Indies. Their commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had established headquarters inland and began planning what he called the General Decisive Battle for Guadalcanal. Japanese confidence ran high. Their intelligence estimates suggested no more than 10,000 American troops defended Henderson Field. Many were sick with malaria and dysentery. Supplies were unlimited. American forces were spread thin around a perimeter too large to defend properly. Japanese commanders believed that a concentrated night assault, executed with proper infantry tactics and samurai spirit, would overwhelm the weakened Marine defenses. This intelligence assessment was partially accurate. The Marines were sick, they were hungry, their uniforms rotted in the tropical humidity. Resupply was inconsistent, but Japanese commanders made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed that desperation equaled vulnerability. They didn't understand that these were the same Marines who had been killing Japanese soldiers at brutally efficient rates since August. Men who had learned, through repeated combat, that American firepower could multiply effectiveness beyond anything achievable through bayonet charges and banzai spirit. More critically, the Japanese didn't understand what American Marines could accomplish when given time to prepare defensive positions and integrate every available weapon system into a coordinated killing mechanism. The southern perimeter of Henderson Field ran along a series of low ridges about 2,000 yards inland from the beach. These ridges weren't dramatic terrain features. They rose only 10 to 20 feet above the surrounding ground. Dense jungle covered the slopes. Ravines and draws broke up the terrain. To the casual eye, they looked like any other stretch of Guadalcanal's interior jungle, but to Louis Puller, those ridges were perfect defensive terrain. They offered observation down the southern slopes toward the jungle, where Japanese forces were assembling. They provided covered positions for machine guns and mortars. The forward slopes created natural killing zones where attacking forces would be exposed while climbing toward Marine positions. Most importantly, the ridges were close enough to Henderson Field that Army artillery positioned behind the airfield could deliver precision fire on any point along the defensive line. In mid-October, as intelligence reports confirmed that a major Japanese offensive was imminent, Puller's battalion received the most critical assignment on the entire perimeter: hold the southern ridge line. His sector extended roughly 1,500 yards from the Lunga River on his right to the boundary, with 5th Marines on his left. 600 men to hold 1,500 yards of front. Under standard defensive doctrine, this was absurdly thin. Proper defense required at least one man every 3 to 4 yards, with reserves for counterattack and depth positions in case the front line broke. Puller had 2 men for every 10 yards, no reserves, no depth. If the line broke, there was nothing behind it except Henderson Field itself. But Puller wasn't planning a conventional defense. He was planning something the Japanese had never encountered in their entire military experience. He was planning to turn his entire sector into an integrated system where every weapon, every obstacle, every fire support asset worked together as a single precision instrument of destruction. And he was planning to do something that required more discipline than courage. He was planning to let thousands of enemy soldiers advance to within 30 yards of his positions, before his Marines fired their first shot. The preparation began on October 20th. Puller walked his entire sector repeatedly, studying every terrain feature. He identified the exact routes Japanese troops would have to use if they attacked up the ridge. He marked the places where ravines would channel advancing troops into concentrated formations. He noted where the jungle thinned enough to provide fields of fire and where it remained thick enough to provide concealment. Then he began building the system. First, the wire. Marine engineers strung triple-apron barbed wire along the entire front, positioning it 30 to 50 yards downslope from the ridge crest. The placement was critical. Too close into the Marine positions, and the wire would hinder counterattacks or withdrawal. Too far forward, and Japanese troops could cut through it without being under direct fire. Puller positioned the wire at exactly the distance where Japanese soldiers would become entangled while fully exposed to Marine weapons. The wire wasn't designed to stop an attack. It was designed to slow attackers at the precise moment they became most vulnerable to coordinated fire. Second, the machine guns. Puller's battalion had 12 Browning 30 caliber machine guns. These were the defensive backbone of any Marine infantry battalion. Each gun could fire up to 500 rounds per minute with trained crews. Properly positioned, a single machine gun could sweep a front of 100 yards. Puller positioned each gun personally. He didn't place them to fire straight ahead down obvious approach routes. Instead, he positioned them so their fire would sweep parallel to the front, creating interlocking cones of fire that would cut across attacking formations like scythes. If Japanese troops advanced up the ridge, they wouldn't face fire coming at them from directly ahead. They would face fire sweeping across their entire formation from multiple angles simultaneously. Each machine gun crew received detailed range cards showing exact distances to terrain features. Trees, rock outcroppings, bends in ravines, the wire line itself. The gun crews measured these distances during daylight and marked them on their cards. They hammered aiming stakes into the ground in front of their positions. At night, in complete darkness, they could maintain accurate fire simply by aligning their guns with the stakes and firing along pre-measured azimuths. Third, the mortars. The battalion's 81mm mortar section had 9 tubes. These weapons could drop high explosive or illumination rounds on targets up to 3,000 yards away. Puller positioned the mortars in defilade positions behind the Karth at ridge crest where they were protected from direct fire. The mortar crews spent days registering their weapons on pre-plotted target zones to the front. They created detailed firing charts. Every ravine, every piece of open ground, every likely assembly area received a target number. The mortar crews computed exact deflection and elevation data for each target. They test-fired during daylight to verify accuracy, then adjusted the data. By October 24th, the mortar crews could drop rounds on any point within range simply by calling out a target number. No corrections needed, no adjustments, just immediate, accurate fire. The mortars stockpiled ammunition. Standard load tables called for 60 rounds per tube. Puller demanded 3 times that amount. Each mortar position accumulated 180 rounds, high explosive for killing, illumination for visibility, white phosphorus for marking and terror effect. Fourth, and most decisively, the artillery. This was the element that would transform Puller's defense from merely effective to absolutely devastating. Behind Henderson Field, Army artillery battalions had emplaced their guns specifically to support the southern perimeter. The 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, had 12 105mm howitzers. The 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, had 12 155mm howitzers. Combined, these 24 guns could deliver more than 4 tons of high explosive per minute on any target within range. Forward observers from the artillery battalions moved into Puller's sector with radio sets and field telephones. These observers were the critical link between the infantry on the ridge and the guns behind Henderson Field. They spent days walking the ground, identifying every piece of terrain that might matter in a defensive fight. They plotted defensive fire zones. Every ravine became a target, every draw, every piece of open ground, every likely approach route, every place where attacking troops might mass or take cover. The observers assigned each location a target number and computed the firing data needed to hit it. Deflection, elevation, charge, fuse setting. Every variable was calculated and recorded. Then they test-fired. During daylight on October 23rd, the artillery battalions fired their defensive concentrations. Puller and his company commanders watched from the ridge as shells impacted on pre-plotted coordinates. When the impact point was slightly off target, the observers adjusted the firing data. They test-fired again. They adjusted again. They repeated this process until every defensive concentration landed exactly where it was supposed to. By the evening of October 24th, the artillery battalions had registration data for 58 separate defensive fire missions in Puller's sector alone. Any observer could call a target number over the radio, and shells would impact on that exact location within 60 seconds. No corrections needed, no adjustments, just immediate, precise, devastating fire. The fifth element was experimental, and no one was certain it would work. But if it did work, it might prove decisive. Marine engineers positioned truck-mounted searchlights on the ridge behind Puller's forward positions. These lights were normally used for airfield operations or anti-aircraft defense. Using them to illuminate a battlefield was untested doctrine. The theory was straightforward. If you could see the enemy clearly at night, you could kill them as efficiently as in daylight. But no one knew if it would work in practice. Would the lights blind, defending troops as much as attacking troops? Would they provide aiming points for enemy artillery? Would they even penetrate the jungle canopy enough to be useful? Puller decided to risk it. The searchlights were positioned and tested. They could illuminate the entire forward slope. The crews practiced rapid engagement and displacement in case they drew counter-battery fire. By October 24th, the searchlights were ready. The final element was ammunition. Standard load tables specified how much ammunition each weapon and position should have on hand. Puller ignored these tables. He demanded that every fighting position stock far more ammunition than doctrine required. Machine gun crews received 3 to 4 times their normal basic load. Some positions had more than 10,000 rounds per gun. Riflemen carried extra bandoliers beyond their normal load. Mortar positions built ammunition dumps with hundreds of rounds. Supply sergeants protested. Moving this much ammunition forward was difficult. It exceeded its carrying capacity. It created logistical problems. Puller didn't care. He told them to find a way. They found a way. By the morning of October 24th, Puller's sector was ready. Every element of the defensive system was in place. Wire positioned at optimal distance. Machine guns sighted for interlocking fire. Mortars registered on pre-plotted targets. Artillery ready to fire 58 separate defensive concentrations on demand. Searchlights positioned and tested. Ammunition stockpiled far beyond normal requirements. Now came the hardest part. Convincing 600 Marines to trust the system enough to hold their fire while thousands of enemy soldiers advanced to point-blank range. Puller spent October 24th moving along his lines, talking to his company commanders and squad leaders. The orders were simple but psychologically difficult. Absolute fire discipline. No one fires until company commanders give the signal. Let the enemy come close. Very close. When the firing starts, maintain controlled fire. Aimed shots. Short machine gun bursts. Make every round count. Trust the artillery. Trust the mortars. Trust the system. Some Marines understood immediately. Veterans who had fought since August knew that discipline multiplied effectiveness. They had seen what happened when troops, too, fired too early. The enemy took cover and infiltrated through gaps in the defensive fire. Better to wait, to let the enemy commit fully, than destroy them with concentrated fire they couldn't escape. Other Marines, particularly replacements who had arrived recently, were terrified by the concept. The natural instinct when facing enemy infantry at close range was to fire. Fire immediately, fire constantly. The idea of watching enemy soldiers cut through your wire barriers while you held your rifle and did nothing violated every combat instinct. But Puller's presence steadied them. Chesty Puller was a legend in the division. If he said wait, then you waited. If he said the system would work, then you trusted the system. The Marines didn't fully understand the mathematics of interlocking fires and pre-registered artillery concentrations, but they understood that their commander did. That was enough. As afternoon faded to evening on October 24th, the sounds from the jungle intensified. Japanese forces were massing in the jungle south of the ridge. Through breaks in the vegetation, Marines could occasionally glimpse movement, large formations, many men, the sound of equipment being staged, officers giving orders. The noise grew steadily through the evening. Marine listening posts pushed forward into the jungle reported large-scale troop movements. Estimates ranged from 2,000 to 4,000 enemy soldiers. Some reports suggested even more. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was that this was clearly the main Japanese effort. This wasn't a probe or a diversionary attack. This was the assault that Japanese commanders expected would break through the Marine perimeter and reach Henderson Field. Colonel Akinosuke Oka commanded the Japanese forces preparing to attack Puller's sector. His orders were direct: assault the American positions, break through their lines, and push north to Henderson Field. Oka commanded approximately 3,500 troops from the 29th Infantry Regiment, reinforced with heavy weapons and supported by artillery. These were veteran soldiers. They had trained for night operations. They had studied American defensive tactics. They believed they could succeed. Japanese intelligence had briefed them that American forces were weak, spread thin, many are sick with disease, low on supplies, unable to sustain prolonged combat. A determined night assault, executed with proper spirit and infantry tactics, would overwhelm the defenders. The Americans would break and retreat. The ridgeline would fall. Henderson Field would be within reach. This assessment was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were about to encounter. The Japanese had fought Chinese armies that lacked coordinated fire support. They had fought colonial troops in Southeast Asia who couldn't call on substantial artillery. Night infiltration tactics and close assault had worked against these opponents because those opponents couldn't deliver massed, precise fire in darkness. American Marines were different. They had artillery. They had communications. They had searchlights. They had stockpiled ammunition. Most critically, they had taken the time to integrate all these elements into a coordinated system specifically designed to destroy attacking infantry. The Japanese didn't know any of this. They couldn't see the artillery battalions behind Henderson Field. They couldn't see the pre-registered fire zones. They couldn't see the interlocking machine gun positions. They couldn't see the searchlights waiting to illuminate the battlefield. They saw only a thinly held ridgeline defended by perhaps 200 meters of visible positions. It looked vulnerable. It looked like it would break under pressure. It was the most lethal trap of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Japanese artillery opened fire. Shells crashed into the ridge. The barrage was heavy but poorly coordinated. Some rounds fell short, exploding in the jungle well forward of Marine positions. Others overshot, landing behind the ridge. The few shells that landed on target did minimal damage because Marines were in covered foxholes. The barrage lasted approximately 20 minutes, then ceased. From his command post, Puller listened to the artillery fall. He noted the lack of accuracy. The Japanese clearly hadn't registered their guns properly. They were firing area bombardment rather than precision fires. This suggested poor fire control and inadequate preparation. It also suggested the Japanese didn't have forward observers integrated with their assault units. They were firing blind, hoping to suppress American positions through volume rather than accuracy. This was a mistake that would cost them dearly. After the artillery stopped, silence fell. Not the normal jungle silence, but the eerie quiet that precedes major combat. Both sides were listening, waiting. Then, from the jungle, voices, commands in Japanese. The sound intensified. Many men are moving, equipment rattling, the rustling of hundreds of soldiers pushing through vegetation. The assault was beginning. Marine listening posts reported large formations moving upslope toward the wire. No attempt at stealth now. They were coming in strength. The noise grew louder. Hundreds of boots on the jungle floor. Officers calling out orders repeatedly. The sound swept toward the ridge like an approaching wave. Puller stood at his command post with his executive officer and operations officer. They estimated at least 3,000 soldiers were moving toward their positions. His executive officer asked if they should call artillery fire on the assembly areas. Puller said no, not yet. Let them commit fully. Let them push through the jungle. Let them reach the wire. Let them bunch up at the obstacles. Then we kill them. The Japanese advance continued. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the lead elements reached the wire barriers. The noise changed, wire cutters snapping through steel cables. Men cursing in Japanese as barbs tore clothing and flesh. Soldiers bunching up at gaps in the wire, waiting for engineers to cut wider openings. The entire assault was slowing as thousands of troops tried to funnel through narrow breaches. This was exactly what Puller had designed the wire placement to achieve. The wire wasn't stopping the attack. It was channeling the attack, forcing it to concentrate, creating clusters of troops in known locations that were already registered as artillery target zones. In the Marine foxholes, fingers tightened on triggers. The enemy was 50 yards away now, then 40 yards. Some Marines could hear individual Japanese soldiers talking. Officers and NCOs could be heard clearly, calling out orders and encouragement. The sound of wire cutting continued. More gaps opened. More troops pushed forward. Company commanders had to physically restrain some Marines from firing. Hold your fire. Wait for the signal. Trust the plan. The discipline held, but barely. Every instinct screamed to engage an enemy that was now less than 30 yards away in some sectors. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, Japanese soldiers began emerging from the last wire barriers. They had cut through the final obstacles. Now they were in the open, climbing the last 30 yards of slope toward Marine positions. Officers were urging them forward. Small groups began running upslope. Puller gave the signal. Every searchlight blazed on simultaneously. 6 truck-mounted searchlights switched from darkness to maximum illumination in an instant. The jungle slope exploded into brilliant white light, brighter than daylight. 3,500 Japanese soldiers were suddenly completely visible, caught in the wire, bunched in attack formations, fully exposed on open ground, no cover, no concealment, nowhere to hide. For perhaps 2 full seconds, both sides froze in mutual shock. The Japanese were suddenly visible after advancing in darkness for more than an hour. The Marines at the sheer number of enemy soldiers crowding every square yard of slope to their front. There were hundreds of them, thousands of them, packed together, all illuminated as if standing on a stage. Then Puller's system activated. Every weapon fired simultaneously. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 12 Browning .30 caliber machine guns opened fire at once, not firing wildly, not spraying bullets randomly. Firing in controlled bursts along pre-registered azimuths, their tracers sweep across the slope in interlocking patterns. The machine gun fire was devastating. At 30 to 50 yards range, every burst found targets. Bodies fell in groups. Soldiers dove for cover that didn't exist. 600 rifles fired in coordinated volleys. Marines had been trained to fire aimed shots rather than automatic fire. At this range, in this light, every shot hit. Japanese soldiers climbing the slope fell as if they had run into an invisible wall. 81mm mortar rounds began impacting 3 seconds after the searchlights activated. The mortar crews had been tracking the assault's progress by sound. They knew approximately where enemy formations were massing. When the lights came on, forward observers immediately called fire missions by target number. The mortar crews fired pre-registered missions. No adjustments needed. The rounds fell exactly where they were supposed to fall. Illumination rounds burst overhead, keeping the slope lit even if the searchlights were destroyed. High explosive rounds airburst over Japanese concentrations still in the wire, spraying shrapnel downward. The airbursts were spectacularly effective against troops caught in the open with no overhead cover. But the decisive element was artillery. Forward observers with pullers companies called fire missions within seconds of the searchlights activating. They used pre-assigned target numbers. Target 17. Fire for effect. Target 23. Fire for effect. Target 9. Fire for effect. The calls went out over field telephones and radio nets to the gun batteries behind Henderson Field. The first artillery salvos impacted approximately 60 seconds after Puller gave the signal to open fire. 105mm and 155mm high explosive shells began falling on pre-registered coordinates with perfect accuracy. No ranging shots needed, no adjustments. Just immediate, precise, devastating fire on targets that had been plotted and test-fired for days. The artillery concentrations hit Japanese soldiers still tangled in the wire. The explosions were catastrophic. Each shell killed or wounded everyone within a 15-yard radius. Bodies disintegrated. Survivors were hurled through the air. Men who had been standing disappeared. The wire barriers themselves became instruments of death as shell fragments ricocheted through the steel cables, multiplying the fragmentation effect. The searchlights meant forward observers could see exactly where Japanese soldiers were clustering and adjust fire accordingly. When a group tried to take cover in a ravine, the observer called the target number for that ravine. Shells arrived within 60 seconds. When soldiers bunched up behind a fallen log, the observer called fire on that grid square. The log and everyone behind it vanished in a high explosive detonation. The integration of fires created effects that were greater than the sum of the parts. Machine guns forced Japanese soldiers to seek cover. Mortars hit the covered positions. Artillery hit the larger concentrations. Rifles killed individuals who tried to maneuver between covered positions. There was no safe ground. Every action a Japanese soldier took to avoid one weapon system exposed him to another. Japanese officers tried to organize charges forward through the fire. Small groups made it through the wire and rushed upslope toward Marine foxholes. They were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire at ranges under 20 yards. Some reached within 10 yards of Marine positions before collapsing under multiple hits. None reached the foxholes themselves. The volume of fire was simply too dense. Every square yard of the slope was beaten by multiple weapons. Japanese soldiers who stood up to advance were killed immediately. Soldiers who stayed down were killed by artillery and mortars. Soldiers who tried to crawl forward were shot by Marines who could see them clearly in the searchlight beams. There was no tactic that worked, no maneuver that succeeded, no way to survive in the killing zone. Other Japanese groups tried to withdraw back into the jungle. This proved equally fatal. Forward observers shifted artillery fire to catch retreating troops. The observers called fire missions, walking the shell impacts down the slope, following the Japanese withdrawal. Soldiers who had been 75 yards from Marine positions died at 100 yards while trying to escape. Some made it 150 yards before artillery caught them. A few reached 200 yards. Almost none made it back to the assembly areas they had departed from an hour earlier. The noise was overwhelming. Artillery shells impact every few seconds, each detonation a physical hammer blow. Machine guns firing sustained bursts, their cyclic rate creating a continuous roar, rifles cracking in controlled volleys, mortar rounds exploding overhead and on impact, Japanese soldiers screaming, officers shouting orders, radio calls for fire missions overlapping. Individual sounds merged into one continuous roar of industrial violence. The smell was equally intense: cordite from rifles and machine guns, TNT from high-explosive shells, blood and torn earth, the acrid chemical smell of white, phosphorus rounds, burned flesh. The jungle itself burned where phosphorus had ignited vegetation. Colonel Oka tried desperately to maintain the assault. He committed his reserves, pushing fresh troops forward to replace units that had been shattered in the initial attack. But the effect was simply to feed more soldiers into the killing zone. The searchlights made concealment impossible. The pre-registered fires meant every concentration point became a target within seconds. The interlocking machine gun positions meant there were no gaps in the defensive fire to exploit. Japanese tactics, which had worked so effectively against other opponents, failed completely against this integrated defensive system. Night infiltration only worked if the enemy couldn't see you. The searchlights eliminated that advantage. Close assault only worked if you could close the distance before taking prohibitive casualties. The interlocking fires made closing impossible. Mass assault only worked if the enemy's firepower could be saturated. The artillery concentrations meant massing simply created better targets. Around midnight, Japanese artillery opened fire again, attempting to suppress Marine positions and destroy the searchlights. Some shells landed accurately on the ridge crest. 2 Marines were killed by a direct hit on their foxhole. 3 searchlights were damaged by near misses and shell fragments. But American counter-battery fire was faster and more accurate than anything the Japanese could achieve. American artillery forward observers had been tracking Japanese gun positions by muzzle flash since the first barrage. When the Japanese guns fired again, American batteries engaged them directly with counter-battery missions. The 155mm howitzers, with their greater range and heavier shells, proved particularly effective. Several Japanese guns were destroyed outright. Others were forced to displace, disrupting their fire support for the infantry. Assault. The counter-battery exchange lasted approximately 20 minutes. The Americans maintained fire throughout. The Japanese fire slackened, then stopped. The surviving Japanese guns had exhausted their ammunition or been destroyed. The American guns continued firing defensive concentrations in support of Puller's infantry. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Oka committed his final reserves in one last coordinated assault. He concentrated his remaining effective troops, perhaps 1,500 men who were still combat-capable, on a narrow front, hoping to achieve breakthrough by concentration of force rather than tactical superiority. Forward observers, watching from Puller's command post, saw the mass of troops forming in the jungle. They called this target-rich concentration to the artillery fire direction center. What followed was the heaviest artillery concentration of the entire night. 8 batteries, 24 guns, total fired time on target. Missions. This meant all 24 shells were timed to impact simultaneously on the target area. The guns fired at slightly different times based on their distance from the target, so all shells arrived at the same instant despite different times of flight. The first time on target mission dropped 24 high-explosive shells on Oka's assault formation within a 2-second window. The blast effect was apocalyptic. The entire target area disappeared in a massive combined detonation. Trees splintered, earth fountained upward. Every Japanese soldier in the impact zone was killed or catastrophically wounded. The formation simply ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. The artillery continued firing for 3 more minutes, walking additional shells through the target area to catch any survivors attempting to withdraw. By the time the fire lifted, Oka's final assault had been annihilated before it could even begin climbing toward Marine positions. By 3 o'clock in the morning, organized Japanese attacks had ceased. The slope in front of Puller's positions was covered with bodies. Hundreds of them. Perhaps more than 1,000. Some areas had corpses stacked 2 and 3 deep where artillery had caught dense formations. The wire entanglements were thick with dead and wounded soldiers who had become tangled and been killed before they could cut free. Wounded Japanese soldiers could be heard calling for help throughout the darkness. Some called for medics, others called for their mothers. The cries continued for hours. Marine corpsmen wanted to go forward and provide aid, but movement in front of the lines would draw fire from Japanese soldiers still hiding in shell craters and behind fallen trees. The wounded would have to wait for dawn. Individual Japanese soldiers and small groups continued trying to withdraw south into the jungle. Marine fire was no longer the continuous roar of the assault phase, but rifles still cracked periodically as Marines shot at movement. Machine gunners fired short bursts at targets of opportunity. The systematic killing continued through the early morning hours, but at reduced intensity. There were simply fewer targets. Puller ordered searchlights turned off at 4 o'clock in the morning. Dawn would arrive in approximately 90 minutes. He wanted Marines to preserve their night vision for the final phase. The lights had proven decisive, but they had also made Marine positions conspicuous. Better to return to darkness for the period before first light. In the darkness after the lights went out, the true scale of the carnage became evident through sound alone. Wounded men moaning, others cried out, some called in Japanese for help that wouldn't come. The sounds painted a picture of catastrophic losses. Puller's staff officers began estimating casualties based on the density of noise and the known size of the attacking force. Their estimates ranged from 800 to 1,200 Japanese dead in Puller's sector alone. The estimates would prove conservative. First light came at approximately 5:30 on October 25th. As visibility increased, Marines in the forward foxholes could finally see what the night had wrought. The jungle slope that had been green vegetation 24 hours earlier was now torn earth, shattered trees, scattered equipment, and bodies. Hundreds upon hundreds of bodies. The wire barriers were grotesque. Dozens of corpses hung in the steel cables where soldiers had been killed while trying to cut through. Some had been shot. Others had been killed by artillery while tangled and unable to move. The wire itself was torn in places by shell impacts, but most of the barriers remained intact, still festooned with bodies and equipment. The ground between the wire and Marine positions was carpeted with dead. They lay in all positions, some face down as if diving for cover, others on their backs, staring at the sky. Many were torn apart by artillery, their bodies incomplete. Equipment littered the slope, rifles, packs, helmets, ammunition. The debris field extended 200 yards down slope. Marine Company commanders organized patrols at full dawn. The patrols moved forward carefully. Japanese survivors occasionally fired from hidden positions, but most resistance had ended. The patrol's primary mission was counting bodies and searching the dead for intelligence documents. The count rose steadily through the morning. 200 dead within 50 yards of Marine positions, 400 within 100 yards, 600 within 150 yards, 700, 800, 900. By mid-morning, the count in Puller's sector alone had exceeded 1,000. Patrols pushed farther into the jungle and found more bodies. Soldiers killed by artillery while trying to withdraw. Men who had been wounded in the assault and died during the night. The count continued climbing. Final official tallies confirmed 1,100 Japanese dead within 500 yards of Puller's positions. This count included only bodies that could be positively identified and counted. It did not include soldiers buried by shell impacts, bodies in areas too dangerous to search due to unexploded ordnance, or soldiers who had been wounded and carried away by comrades during the night. Captured Japanese soldiers and documents suggested that approximately 500 additional wounded had been evacuated during the assault. Many of these subsequently died from their wounds. Total Japanese casualties in the attack on Puller's sector, killed and wounded combined, exceeded 1,600 men. Of Colonel Oka's 3,500-man assault force, fewer than 1,900 made it back to Japanese lines. Many of those were wounded or psychologically shattered by what they had experienced. Marine casualties in 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 9 killed in action, 25 wounded. The exchange ratio was staggering, more than 120 Japanese casualties for every Marine casualty. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense. This was industrial-scale killing made possible by superior technology, superior preparation, and superior fire discipline. The weapons system that had inflicted the most casualties was artillery. Post-battle analysis by the Army artillery battalions estimated they had fired more than 6,000 rounds into the defensive fire zones in front of Puller's position during the 6-hour engagement. At an average weight of 90 pounds per high-explosive shell for the 155mm howitzers and 33 pounds for the 105mm howitzers, this represented approximately 60 tons of high explosive delivered with precision on pre-registered coordinates. Machine guns had fired an estimated 80,000 rounds. The math was straightforward: 12 guns firing an average of 6,700 rounds each over 6 hours. Some guns had fired more, some less, but the total approached 80,000. At a density of 1 hit per dozen rounds fired at typical engagement ranges, this suggested approximately 6,500 hits on enemy personnel. Given that many soldiers were hit multiple times, this translated to perhaps 3,000 casualties directly attributable to machine gun fire. Individual Marine riflemen had averaged approximately 60 rounds fired during the engagement. Some marksmen had fired far fewer. They were selecting targets carefully and firing only when certain of hits. Others had fired 100 rounds or more during the most intense phases, but 60 rounds per man was a reasonable average for 600 Marines, suggesting total rifle fire of 36,000 rounds. At the close ranges involved and the excellent visibility provided by searchlights, hit rates were far higher than normal combat. Perhaps 20% of rifle shots hit, suggesting 7,000 hits and perhaps 2,000 casualties directly from rifle fire. Mortars had contributed perhaps 2,000 rounds of high explosive and illumination. The illumination rounds had kept the battlefield lit after several searchlights were damaged. The high explosive rounds had achieved perhaps 300 casualties. The searchlights themselves hadn't killed anyone directly, but they had made every other weapon far more effective. Post-battle interviews with Japanese prisoners revealed that the sudden illumination had been psychologically devastating. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently in darkness suddenly found themselves exposed on an open slope with nowhere to hide. Unit cohesion collapsed. Officers lost control. Men froze or panicked. The lights had transformed a night infiltration assault into a daylight attack, without any of the preparation or supporting fires that made daylight attacks viable. But the single most important factor hadn't been any particular weapon system. It had been fire discipline. 600 Marines had held their fire, while thousands of enemy soldiers advanced to knife-fighting range. That discipline, that trust in the plan, had allowed the defensive fires to achieve maximum effect. If Marines had opened fire at 100 yards, the Japanese would have taken cover in the jungle and infiltrated through gaps in the fire. By waiting until enemy soldiers were fully exposed at 30 yards with no cover available, the Marines had ensured that escape was nearly impossible, and survival was a matter of chance rather than skill or tactics. The destruction of Oka's force on the night of October 24th to 25th was part of a larger Japanese failure across the entire Henderson Field perimeter. While Puller's battalion was annihilating the western assault, Japanese forces attacking east and south of Henderson Field met similar fates. Different terrain, different Marine units, but the same fundamental pattern: night attacks into prepared defenses backed by overwhelming American firepower. By October 26th, General Hyakutake's general decisive battle for Guadalcanal had failed catastrophically. The Sendai Division had suffered approximately 3,500 killed and thousands more wounded across all sectors of the perimeter. American casualties for the entire battle were fewer than 200 killed. The Japanese offensive was not just defeated, it was annihilated. More importantly, Japanese tactical doctrine had encountered something it couldn't overcome: American industrial firepower coordinated with disciplined infantry defense. Japanese military training emphasized aggressive spirit, skill at arms, and tactical excellence. These qualities had proven sufficient against Chinese armies that lacked artillery support and fire coordination. They had worked against colonial forces in Southeast Asia who couldn't call on substantial fire support. They failed completely against Americans, who could deliver tons of precision fire on demand and had the tactical sophistication to integrate that firepower with infantry defense. Japanese soldiers who survived the battle told interrogators they had never experienced anything comparable to the artillery concentrations. One officer, captured several days later, said it was like being caught in an earthquake made of steel and fire. Another said the searchlights made them feel like insects being examined before extermination. The psychological impact of the defeat matched the physical casualties. For the Marine Corps, October 24th to 25th became validation that integrated defensive tactics worked. The combination of prepared positions, coordinated fires, searchlights for visibility, and absolute fire discipline could defeat numerically superior forces with minimal friendly casualties. This tactical approach would be refined and repeated throughout the Pacific War. From Tarawa to Peleliu to Iwo Jima, Marines would use similar integrated defensive systems to break Japanese attacks. The battle also cemented Louis Puller's reputation as one of the Marine Corps' finest tactical commanders. His instinct for terrain, his insistence on thorough preparation, and his ability to convince his men to trust the plan had turned a potentially desperate defense into a one-sided slaughter. He received the Navy Cross for his actions that night, his third of an eventual 5, more than any other Marine in the Corps' history. But Puller himself was characteristically blunt when asked about the victory. In his view, it wasn't the Marines who had won, though they had performed magnificently. It was the system, the preparation, the artillery, the coordination. The Americans had more steel to throw at the Japanese than the Japanese had bodies to throw at the Americans. In the end, mathematics overwhelmed my spirit. Industrial capacity overcame tactical skill. That was the fundamental reality of the Pacific War, and October 24th had been a perfect demonstration of that reality. Captured Japanese documents revealed the profound shock the battle had caused among enemy commanders. Colonel Oka's after-action report, recovered weeks later from his abandoned command post, was remarkable for its honesty about Japanese failures. He had been told by intelligence that Americans were poorly supplied and spread thin. Instead, he had encountered artillery concentrations heavier than anything he had experienced during years of combat in China. He had expected wire and machine guns. Instead, he had found searchlights that turned night into day and defensive fires that seemed to anticipate every move his troops made. The report was brutally clear about one conclusion: Japanese infantry, regardless of training or spirit, could not survive the material thrown at them by American forces. Close assault tactics required closing to hand range. That was impossible against searchlights and massed fires. Night infiltration required darkness and concealment. The Americans had eliminated both. Mass assault required that enemy firepower could be overwhelmed by numbers. The artillery made numbers irrelevant. More troops simply meant more casualties. This realization was spreading through Japanese ranks on Guadalcanal throughout November and December. Survivors of the October battles told other units what they had encountered. The Americans didn't just have more supplies, they had fundamentally different capabilities. They could see in darkness. They could drop shells with precision on radio calls. They could maintain devastating fire for hours without exhausting ammunition. Every element that Japanese tactics relied upon, darkness, close quarters, surprise, the Americans could neutralize through technology and preparation. Japanese tactical doctrine had no ready answer for this. Searchlights required portable generators and vehicle-mounted platforms. Radios required communication, equipment, and trained operators. Artillery support required ammunition stockpiles that had to be transported forward. Integrated defensive fires required time for preparation, registration, and coordination. Japan's deteriorating supply situation on Guadalcanal made all of this impossible. American aircraft and naval forces interrupted Japanese supply runs. The troops ashore were slowly starving, let alone being able to stockpile artillery ammunition or position searchlights. By early November, Japanese commanders privately acknowledged that Guadalcanal could not be held. The October attacks had been the last realistic chance to retake Henderson Field. Their failure meant Americans would hold the airfield indefinitely. Without the airfield, Japanese forces couldn't control the surrounding waters. Without control of the waters, they couldn't reinforce or adequately supply troops ashore. The strategic logic was inescapable. Japan began planning withdrawal rather than reinforcement. The decision took time. No one wanted to be the officer who recommended abandoning Japanese soldiers to their fate. But by late December, the decision was made. In early February 1943, Japan evacuated its remaining forces from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Approximately 11,000 soldiers who had landed to retake the island withdrew in a series of night destroyer runs. They left behind more than 25,000 dead from combat, disease, and starvation. Henderson Field remained in American hands. From that base, American aircraft would support the drive north through the Solomon Islands, then into the Philippines, and eventually to the Japanese home islands themselves. The entire strategic campaign in the Southwest Pacific hinged on holding that single dirt runway on Guadalcanal. And that runway was held in large part because on the night of October 24, 1942, 600 Marines demonstrated that disciplined defense, backed by integrated fires, could annihilate numerically superior attacks. Louis Puller would go on to fight at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and most famously at Chosin Reservoir in Korea, where his 1st Marine Regiment made one of the most celebrated fighting withdrawals in Marine Corps history. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1955 after 37 years of service. He died in 1971 at age 73. Throughout his career, when asked about his most successful action, he frequently cited October 24th on Guadalcanal, not because it was his most challenging fight, but because it was his most perfectly executed defense. The 600 Marines who held that ridge didn't win through heroic charges or desperate last stands. They won by holding their fire when every instinct demanded they shoot, by trusting that their commander's plan would work, by letting enemy soldiers advance to 30 yards before unleashing coordinated fires that turned the slope into a killing ground those soldiers couldn't escape. For the 3,500 Japanese soldiers who attacked that night, October 24th was catastrophic beyond anything their training or experience had prepared them for. They had been told Americans were weak, poorly supplied, and unable to sustain determined attacks. Instead, they encountered an enemy who turned their approach into a precisely calculated walk toward death. The jungle slope they crossed became a 100-yard journey into coordinated violence delivered with industrial precision. They had been taught that spirit and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. On the slope below Henderson Field, they learned differently. They learned that American forces didn't need to match Japanese soldiers in individual courage or night fighting ability. They needed only to create conditions where superior firepower could be brought to bear at the exact moment when it would achieve maximum effect. The noise of that night, the artillery, the machine guns, the screams, the explosions eventually faded. What remained was the lesson. In the Pacific War, American material superiority wasn't merely about having more supplies. It was about transforming those supplies into integrated systems of destruction that made conventional infantry tactics obsolete. It was about the capacity to see in darkness, to deliver tons of precision fire on radio call, to maintain devastating volumes of fire for hours without pause. Japanese tactical doctrine, developed against opponents who lacked these capabilities, had no effective counter. The spirit that had carried Japanese forces to victory across Asia met American industrial capacity on Guadalcanal and broke against it. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, they had demonstrated suicidal bravery repeatedly, but because courage without adequate material support couldn't survive the weight of steel Americans could deliver. On a ridge south of Henderson Field, this reality was demonstrated with mathematical precision. 3,500 soldiers attacked, 1,100 died in 6 hours, another 500 were wounded. The Marine battalion that destroyed them suffered 9 killed. The ratio told the story more clearly than any narrative could. When industrial firepower met infantry assault in conditions where that firepower could be fully employed, the result wasn't combat, it was exterminated. And it happened because 600 Marines trusted their commander enough to let the enemy get within 30 yards before they pulled the trigger. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.